All right. Good evening. Everybody doing good? Great. So welcome to the third installment of the Climate Change series, A Tale of Two Cities in a Hotter World, Los Angeles and Beijing. My name is Luis Chiappe, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Research and Collections at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. I also happen to be a frequent visitor of Beijing. I have done work in Beijing uninterrupted for about 25 years, so it's very, very interested in today's conversation because I've seen a huge transformation in that city. We are thrilled to host this series here at the Tar Pits, an unparalleled wonder, an unparalleled scientific wonder, an active urban field site, where an immersion into prehistoric Los Angeles helps us understand our world now and in the future. The Tar Pits represent one of the best opportunities anywhere in the world to understand how ecosystems respond to long-term processes of environmental change. So very appropriate for this series. We're proud to partner with UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability on this climate change series. It's a true collaboration in efforts to expand our reach to the communities of Los Angeles. I want to thank the IoES Director, Peter Kariba, and his staff, including the Head of Strategic Initiatives, David Schlaze, for co-organizing these panels. I also want to thank the NHM staff, in particular our Vice President of Education and Programs, Sue O, Laura Robinson, Senior Manager for Public Programs, and Gabe Jorbert, Program Manager. And of course, I want to thank the staff of the Tar Pits who are, here and opening their arms to welcome us. And finally, I also want to thank our sponsor, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. This evening we'll be live streaming on the Tar Pits, the NHM, and the IoES Facebook pages, which explains why you may see a cameraman wandering around. And if you miss some of the previous talks, you can find them, or you can find audio recordings of them on SoundCloud and iTunes, or videos on the Facebook pages. For tonight, it is tough to feel urgency when climate change seems like something happening to future generations and in a faraway land. Now, the reality is that climate change is happening today, and it is affecting all of us in every city on this planet. Now, not every place is being impacted in the same way. To make climate change more personal, more local, and more real, let's talk about how it will affect two of the greatest cities in the world, Beijing and LA. We'll compare notes on how each of these cities' infrastructure and governance impacts on their local biodiversity, as well as how residents may react to the changes. Please join me to welcome our moderator, Stephanie Weir, a marine scientist at the Nature Conservancy, the world's largest environmental organization. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you. So before I get started on my introduction, for those of you that haven't been to the previous events, this is an interactive night. So what we want to start with is making sure everybody is ready. So if you haven't already, get out your smartphone, connect to our Wi-Fi here at the museum, and then go to the pollev.com/IoES. And we actually have a poll active right now, and the question is about, I don't have it exactly in front of me, but it is about how you feel when talking about climate change, right? One word that describes how you feel when talking to someone about climate change, and we want you to be honest. Just whatever you want to say is, we won't edit you. We want to know how you really feel. So I want to just start by introducing myself. So I am a marine ecologist. I've worked for the Nature Conservancy for 16 years, and my focus has been on coral reefs. My work has evolved over that time. A lot of my coral reef work was focused on the impacts of climate change and working with resource managers around the world to minimize the impacts of climate change. But then I started getting interested in the connections between human health and well-being and environmental health. And so I started getting into an unlikely area of looking at sewage and toilets and sanitation, which is not a very sexy topic compared to coral reefs, but it's really fun and funny, as you might imagine, all the potty jokes. But what I also spend a lot of time doing at the Nature Conservancy is figuring out how to communicate issues around environmental problems, climate change, and how to engage audiences in taking action. So I'm going to ask the panelists in a minute to do the same. I want everybody to share, and I'm going to share what the greatest challenge you see in facing climate change. What's the greatest challenge in overcoming it, and also what makes you optimistic about meeting those challenges. So for me, I think the greatest challenge is the today mindset. We have have a hard time imagining the future or taking action towards the future. And so I think getting people to think about the future and understanding that maybe it's not so far off is one of our greatest challenges. What I'm optimistic about is that there's actually been a lot of exciting momentum and collaboration in the last couple of years. The Paris Agreement is something that has made me very optimistic about addressing climate change. And despite the U.S. federal government backing out of their agreements, the fact that businesses and states in the U.S. are all stepping up to fill those gaps that our federal government is currently not committed to addressing, that's exciting and inspiring and really makes me feel optimistic that people are recognizing that it's not just up to our governments to solve this problem, but it's up to us individually and as businesses. So I think we're going to go ahead and just check in on that poll real quick, just to see how everybody's feeling, and then have our panelists introduce themselves. So juiced. That's really interesting. That means more than one of you said juiced, because that's an indication of how many people answered that question. People collaborate on that? Anxious, concerned, worried, angry, hopeful, passionate, protective, knowledgeable, serious, frustrated. Yeah, okay. Hopeful. I like hopeful. Okay, we're going to check in on that at the end of this as well. Okay, so we've got some confusion tonight. We have two Alex's. So we're going to go with AlexH, Alex W, and then Brad. So Brad makes it easy. So let's start with AlexH. If you could introduce yourself and answer those questions, that would be great.
Sure. I study climate change from a physical perspective. I have done a lot of work looking at how we model the global climate and how we can improve our understanding of the mechanisms that shape how the climate is changing over time. And recently I've done a lot of work also on projecting regional climate change, especially here in Los Angeles and in California. And as far as what I think the challenges are, I think it's similar to what you said. I think that there's, I guess my greatest concern is that we aren't changing fast enough, that we won't ultimately reduce our emissions fast enough to make enough of a difference for the future. And I do think that we are approaching this problem seriously, and I think that's actually what gives me hope and what makes me optimistic, is that I see so much interest in this problem, and there's a seriousness, especially here in California, on reducing emissions, and it's happening at the highest levels of government, and there really are policy changes in place that are making this happen. But my worry is that it's not happening fast enough. So there's my challenge and my reason for optimism all in one.
All right. Good evening. Thanks for having me here tonight. So my background, I'm on the faculty at the law school at UCLA, and my area of focus is really on China's environmental governance. So I look at Chinese law and politics through the way they regulate their environment. Before that, I was a lawyer, a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council for about 6 years, based in Beijing. I helped them set up their Beijing office in 2005 and started a program on environmental law where we worked with regulators, lawyers, NGOs, citizen groups to try to improve transparency, use of the law to enforce environmental laws on the books. And the overarching question was really, how do you translate laws on the books into action and practice? And that's really what I continue to study in my research. And I've been working with China professionally for now almost 25 years. And as the person who introduced us earlier said, it's really remarkable to see the changes that have happened in just 2.5 decades in China. It's created a lot of benefits, but also, as we all know, some of the most serious environmental problems in the world. So as far as the biggest challenge to me, I think the biggest challenge that I think about a lot is, how does the developing world choose to develop going forward, right? We're talking about billions of people, countries with the largest populations in the world, who have aspirations to do as well as the people in the United States and in Europe. And the path that they choose to develop will have enormous consequences for our future. So I think that's the biggest challenge. In terms of what makes me optimistic is, having spent time on the ground in China, a lot of the news stories we get over here tend to be quite negative. And my day-to-day experience was the experience of working with a lot of very dedicated people who really wanted to solve some problems. And to know that that was out there is a reason for me to have optimism. And also, coming back to California, to reiterate what you said, I don't suggest you do this, but if you want to read AB 32 or some of the other California legislation, it's really quite remarkable to read just the opening paragraphs to see, in the popular press there's a lot of debate about, is climate change real and this sort of thing, and it's amazing to look at our state legislation to see the statement of purpose and recognition of the problem, and that's what California is up to, and that gives me a lot of cause for optimism.
I'm going to remind you guys to, as our AV support said, eat the mic. So our live stream audience can hear us.
I will eat the mic. So I'm Brad Shafer. I am a professor in 2 departments, in ecology and evolutionary biology and in the Institute of Environment and Sustainability, where I run a center called the Kretz Center for California Conservation Science at UCLA. In terms of my work, I'm a conservation scientist, and I do a lot of work in California. I'm a biologist, and I study reptiles and amphibians. So in that sense, I'm very much at home in a museum. I'm a biodiversity-oriented person. I know a lot about reptiles and amphibians, and I study them in nature, in the field. And I tend to use a lot of genetic and genomic tools. So we sequence turtles and salamanders and frogs, and we use that information to learn about their evolutionary history, to learn about their ecology, and then to learn about their conservation. So that's the work that I do. The biggest challenge that I see, it's very interesting. For me, the biggest challenge in trying to think about climate change and trying to sort of deal with it and cope with it is the details. So for me, as a biologist, and especially as a biologist who works on things like little lizards and little salamanders, the devil is in the details. So it's one thing to say it's going to get 4 degrees hotter. It's another thing to say we're going to lose all the little moist, tidy holes underneath a rock or underneath a log. And that's what's going to keep the organisms that I work on and care about and care deeply about conserving on our landscapes, or we're going to lose them from our landscapes. And to me, AlexH, the two to my right, does a lot of work on downscale climate change, right? So at the level of a city block, perhaps. I want it at the level of, this cup. I want it to be really small so that I can really understand those ecological details. And for me, in trying to project forward on how the plants and animals that I work on are going to do, that's the challenge. Optimism, I had to think long and hard about this one, to tell you the truth. But for me, my greatest source of optimism right now, aside from, of course, just being in California and the inspiration that is California in terms of all things environmental, is in talking to a lot of millennials that I spend a lot of time talking to over at the university at least, and as well as my own family. And in many ways, the biggest source of optimism for me is that they don't want to be like me. They don't want to own a car. They don't want to drive. They don't want to own a house. They want a much more spare, sort of stripped down lifestyle that's easier to move around, more mobile, less stuck with your stuff. And that's an indication to me of a move away from consumerism, which is a move away from many of the issues that are driving climate change at the sort of individual consumption level. So for me, that's a really cool thing that I'm very excited about.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we are going to play a game tonight. And some of you may have played this game. It's kind of a get-to-know-you game usually. It's called Two Truths and a Lie. And typically what you would do amongst maybe people you don't know very well is you give 3 different, quote, facts about yourself. And they tend to be fairly outrageous. And then the people have to guess which one is the lie. So what we're going to do tonight is give you facts around climate change and some of the results of climate change or causes of it, and ask you to figure out the lie. So we are going to start. Let's put the first slide up and have Alex W. run us through.
Okay, so we'll start with these facts tend to be a bit of bad news. We'll work our way towards some better news towards the end, I think. But we'll start with the first one here. Los Angeles falls into EPA's worst category for ozone pollution violations. It's called extreme non-attainment. And it's not expected to come into compliance for 15 years. Okay, so that's the first one. Second, outdoor air pollution contributes to 1.2 million premature deaths in China annually, nearly 40% of the global total. And then third, we'll show a picture in just a second. This is a January 2013 NASA satellite image of air pollution over Beijing and surrounding regions. Okay. So.
Okay, get out your phones. And you should be able to see the poll. Has everybody seen it? And you make your selection. And then we'll start seeing, we're going to start the timer.
How long do they have?
Love the timer.
Okay, let's see.
Interesting. Interesting.
Hopefully you're not biased by others' answers if you haven't answered yet. We have to give it some time. Okay, so it looks like what we're seeing here is the majority of you think that Los Angeles falls into the EPA's worst category for ozone pollution violations and is not expected to come into compliance for 15 years. So, Alex, that's they're voting on the lie,
Yeah.
sorry. So what is the lie? And can you talk to us about
The
it?
lie is the third one. So that's actually a NASA satellite picture of a forest fire in sort of the Pacific Northwest. And so if you see an actually satellite photo of Beijing and surrounding regions, it looks quite similar on the bad days in Beijing, because in some of the worst days in Beijing, we only have that level of pollution in the States during forest fires. And so I wanted to make that point. As I think we know, sort of one of the sort of connections between Beijing and LA is a history and a challenge with bad air pollution. And it turns out that Los Angeles is still one of the worst, sort of most polluted cities in the country. And on
Oh, you're cheating
Colin,
now.
lock it
That's
down.
cheating.
Colin, this is not right.
Did we lose it? What happened?
So Los Angeles is in what under the Clean Air Act is called extreme non-attainment for ozone. If you look at some of the information from South Coast Air Quality Management District, you'll see in particular the violations are really inland, right? The wind blows in from the ocean, kind of blows pollution in. The mountains trap it in, and sort of inland empire, it bakes during the day, and you get a lot of smog. And so we still have a real problem with that. The good news is that on other pollutants like fine particulate, PM 2.5, we're doing quite a lot better. There are only some violations, and we've largely come into compliance with that. On the health effects, unfortunately, number 2 is true. China does have about 40% of the sort of estimated premature deaths globally. India is a close second, but those two countries, by virtue of having large populations and a lot of pollution, have a heavy burden from health burden from pollution.
So, okay, so this is a huge health burden with air pollution. Can you talk about what kind of illnesses are associated with air pollution?
Yeah, so the two pollutants, for example, that we're talking about here, we've talked about ozone and particulate. So particulate is the one, PM 2.5 is the one that Chinese people have been very focused on recently. In the last few years, it's become well known enough that sort of people are texting around jokes that feature PM 2.5. Awareness about it has grown quite a lot. But PM 2.5 is dangerous because it's very fine, can get deep in your lungs, can enter the bloodstream. It causes lung problems, heart problems, asthma, these types of things. And ozone likewise can cause lung disease and asthma and other problems like that.
You mentioned we were talking earlier also about the impacts on young children and how that affects them.
Oh, right. Yeah. So one of the things that scared me personally the most, our daughter was actually born in Beijing just before we moved back to California. And I had been reading a lot of children's health studies about the impacts of coal pollution on children. And so there's extraordinarily serious sort of measurable effects on brain development. Birth weight is less for children born in heavy coal pollution areas. Head circumference is lower. IQ at age 2 is measurably lower. So it's a real, very serious impacts from air pollution.
So is there reason for optimism here, considering the progress LA has made? The pollution has been greatly diminished. Is there reason for optimism, and what can we learn from what LA has been able to accomplish?
Right. So I think Beijing has been really interested in the LA example because they've seen this. LA in terms of air pollution is a success story. I'm relatively new to LA, but I assume a lot of the folks in the audience have lived here for quite some time, and you remember the pollution from before, right? I mean, the 40s and 50s, the pictures of pollution in LA look like pictures of pollution in Beijing today, and it's been a story of steady progress. The Clean Air Act has been very important to air pollution in the States, and we have a very strong apparatus in the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Cal EPA has worked hard over the last few decades. And Beijing is very much trying to learn from the California experience in terms of pollution regulation, in terms of changing the energy mix, in terms of energy efficiency, these types of things. And so I think there's a lot to learn there.
Great. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next set of alternative facts, truths, lies. We'll decide. Okay, and we're going to have AlexH run us through these.
All right. The average CO2 emitted every year to get imported water to one Angelino is about equal to the weight of Dodgers slugger Yasiel Puig.
Too soon?
The average CO2 emitted every year to get imported water to one Angelino is about equal to what's emitted in China to produce the goods that same Angelino consumes in 1 year. So imported water for one Angelino versus what they consume from China. And the third one is the average CO2 emitted by one Angelino to get around town every year is more than 10 times bigger than what's emitted in China to produce the goods that same Angelino consumes in a year.
Okay, everybody, get out your phones and we can cue the music.
Oh, this is fun to watch. So I want to introduce a new unit of measure, which is the Puig. It's a weight of CO2 emitted.
Can you estimate what a Puig is?
So Puig is about 1/10 of a metric ton.
What is that in pounds?
That's about 240 pounds.
Okay.
It's a little bit less than that, actually, so give or take. That's what we're going to guess his weight is, okay? All right, so it turns out that, it takes about one Puig to get imported water to LA every year. That's how much is emitted to get the water from Northern California to Southern California to urban areas to supply us with water. And that's mainly through the State Water Project and the California Aqueduct. So pumping that water over the Tehachapis takes a lot of energy. That's a big source of emissions in California. So that's one Puig. It takes 12 Puigs to produce the goods that Angelino consumes. So number 2 is actually the lie. The emissions that are emitted in China to supply us with goods are actually substantial, and they're about 12 times greater than the emissions from the California Aqueduct. But it takes 400 Puigs for us to get around every year. So that's how much weight in CO2 is emitted every year by the average person in California, in Los Angeles, to get around town.
Is that driving?
That's mainly driving, yes. So almost half our greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation or mainly automobile emissions. So number 2 is actually the lie, and numbers 1 and 3 are true.
Okay, so how do Angelinos compare to other Americans? And are there unique factors that lower or increase Angelinos' emissions relative to others?
I don't think we're that different. There are a couple of ways in which we are. We do have a bit of a larger transportation footprint than a city like, say, New York, because we have not yet developed our public transit infrastructure to the degree that we need to. We're also a little bit better in the sense that we now get a substantial chunk of our electricity from renewable sources. So if you plug in a device or a vehicle, you're actually not emitting nearly as much as people in other places that rely on coal, for example, or natural gas for electricity generation.
Okay, so we're talking about personal emissions, and I'm hoping there are some in the audience that are wondering how you might reduce yours. If you want to reduce your personal emissions, where's a good place to start?
Well, I think as you might imagine from the last alternative fact out there that actually is a fact, that the emissions from transportation is a place to start. Almost half our emissions come from transportation, if not maybe a little bit more in Los Angeles. So that's really a low-hanging fruit. About 5 months ago or so, I bought an electric car, and it's phenomenal. I like it for many reasons, apart from its emissions footprint. They're just amazing pieces of engineering, and they really are fantastic. So I highly recommend taking that step. And once you convert to an electric vehicle, you wonder why you ever had the other kind of car.
And from what you were saying, you don't have to give up style and substance either with the electric car. I mean, I think a lot of times people think you're having to give something up by making these decisions.
So I've been, over the past 5 years or so, attempting to attack different aspects of my own personal sustainability. And every step that I've taken has ended up making my life better in some important way. So I think it really is true that it can be a better world in terms of quality of life by becoming sustainable.
So does reducing your personal emissions really make a difference in the grand scheme of things? Do you make a difference by doing that, or do you?
So there's something that I think we have to ignite if we want to truly address climate change, and that is social contagion. We have to adopt change so that other people will notice and adopt change as well. That's how change happens, I think, in the end. And it might even be a good thing that we don't have anything happening in Washington, or we have the opposite of action. We have people trying to go in reverse. Because I think it underscores the fact that it is up to us to make these changes. It's the decisions that we make that ultimately will make a difference. And I know, like, my neighbors ask me about my car all the time because they think it's so interesting that I have this thing, and so it's a conversation starter. And I was thrilled the other day. So I saw one of my neighbors driving down the street with his own electric car, and I thought, yes, I convinced this person. So I think it really does make a difference, and I think that's the only way we'll eventually overcome this, is if we all chip in.
Yeah, to make a point, also related point about China, is that on per capita emissions, if you looked at it 10 years ago, China was less than both the United States and Europe. And in terms of sort of aspirational goals, what they would like to be in terms of development is either the US or Europe. Yet the carbon profiles, the carbon footprints of the two places are very different, right? So the US is about twice what China's is now, and just recently China's per capita carbon footprint just surpassed Europe's. So 10 years ago China was less than both. Recently China has surpassed Europe's average and is still about half of the US. And so how China goes in the future, does it become more Europe-like or more US-like, makes a big difference. And then if more people act like AlexH, then we would start to lower our footprint as well. So.
Well, and that's another reason for us in California to make these steps, because I think it's a demonstration that there's not an incompatibility between sustainability and prosperity.
Right.
Can I ask a quick question? Yeah. So a question people ask me a lot, Alex, is if you take the carbon footprint of the electricity that we need in order to run that car, how does that compare to, a 50 mile per gallon Toyota that's running off of gasoline? Do you know how those compare?
Well, it depends on what the electricity source is. If it's a coal-fired electricity plant, that's
Right.
that's different from.
Well, here.
But here in LA, as I said earlier, we get a substantial fraction of our power in Los Angeles from renewable sources, and it's an increasing fraction. There's a mandate to increase that, and there's a real commitment on the part of local utilities to increase reliance on renewables. So I think it's almost half in Los Angeles now that comes from renewables. And the other important thing is, we have to not only reduce our carbon footprint, but we have to invest in infrastructure that will allow us to reduce it in the future. And these sorts of choices, even though they are not necessarily zero carbon, because there is carbon emitted from electricity, they're investments in infrastructure that can become carbon-free later. And I think that's also a key point to make.
Thanks. Okay, so Brad, you're going to take us through the next round.
And I'm about biodiversity. So the first is Beijing, with a human population of roughly 20 million, is home to about twice as many native bird species as Los Angeles County, with a human population of 10 million. So twice as many people, twice as many species of birds, better biodiversity. The second is urban park size is the primary determinant of bird biodiversity in Beijing. Bigger parks have more species of birds. And the third is that previously unknown species, unknown to science entirely, are regularly discovered in megacities such as Beijing, LA, and New York. One of those is false.
Okay, so get out your phones and start the timer music. Okay, we're going to take a look. What are people saying here? Oh, this is interesting. So there seems to be agreement that the lie, well, a majority of you, let's see, we'll give it a second.
I want to give it a second.
Yeah, let's see what happens. Majority looks to be going with number 3 as the lie. So, Alex, can you tell us, or Brad, see this is, I should
Yep.
just, all of you Alex, okay.
We should all
Brad,
be
can you
Alex,
please
that's
tell
right.
us the lie?
So the question is, which is the lie? And in this case, the lie, interestingly enough, is number 2, the one that the fewest people chose. So let's talk about this for a minute, okay? So the lie is urban park size is the primary determinant of bird biodiversity in Beijing. Bigger parks have more bird species, more species of birds. Makes a ton of sense, right? Big area, more species. But the thing you have to think about is, imagine that you make a really big park and it's a giant lawn. Okay? Are you going to have a lot of species of birds or anything else? And the answer is no. You're going to have a lot of pigeons. Okay? And so you may have a whole lot of individual birds or individual insects, but the diversity, the types that we care about so much as conservation scientists and biodiversity scientists is going to be really low. Now, what matters is a little less about size and a little more about the environmental heterogeneity. So if that park has big trees and little trees and shrubs and grass and a stream and a pond and different things like that, different soil types, then you'll get a lot of biodiversity. Now, the fact is that usually bigger chunks of land have more environmental heterogeneity, so also have more species. But it's not always the case. And it turns out there was a really interesting study published very recently on 10 urban parks in Beijing, and they parsed all that out. And what they found was that size was essentially uncorrelated with the number of species of birds, but environmental heterogeneity was very highly correlated. So if we go through the other two just real quickly, Beijing is home to twice as many native species of birds as Los Angeles, which I found pretty astonishing. So the numbers are, there's 435 species of birds found in Beijing, and iNaturalist, which is a great source for birds, at least in California, shows 211 species in LA County. Another thing that I find amazing is that 211 species of birds in LA County, about 800 species of birds in California, and 200 species in Griffith Park. Pretty cool, huh? Okay. And then the third is previously unknown species are regularly discovered in megacities. Well, and we need go no further than Luis Chape, our host who introduced us, and to the curator of insects over at the Natural History Museum, Brian Brown, who, last I checked, had discovered 43 new species of one family of flies in Los Angeles that he collected. These are new to science. Nobody knew these things existed. And as just one other example, 3 or 4 years ago, we found the first new species of frog that had been discovered in 100 years in the East Coast, and we found it on Staten Island in New York City. So there is lots of biodiversity and lots of interesting new discoveries to be made in cities. So there's the answers.
Okay, so the moral of the story is big cities are important for biodiversity, which is not what you might necessarily expect.
Which is not what you might expect. And that's my big moral of this story, is that as conservation biologists, and especially when we think about conservation in the future with climate change, we should not write off big cities in terms of their importance for biodiversity. I mean, LA is never going to be as important as Yosemite, but it's really important. And just as one example of this, this morning I have about a 3-mile walk from my house up to UCLA, and I look for birds a lot. I like to bird watch. And this morning in that walk, in about 50 minutes, I tallied 17 species of birds. And 17 species of birds in my little walk up Veteran Avenue on the west side of LA is about 3% of the total birds that you get in California, and it's about 2% of the total birds you get in the United States. And that's in one little walk in LA. So I think it just says there's a lot of biodiversity here, and it's really important that we preserve it.
So I remember there was a T-shirt in my department in grad school that said, "Adapt, migrate, or die." And I'm wondering what we're seeing in terms of patterns with bird populations with climate change. Are we seeing adaptations? Are we seeing migrations? Are we seeing extinctions? What's happening there?
Yeah, and I think the answer is that we're seeing all three. We are seeing right here in California, certainly, as well as in Beijing. I was just reading a paper about this the other day. We're certainly seeing sort of a combination of adaptation and migration. So just for instance, a number of different kinds of birds that used to be migratory are becoming non-migratory. There's a very common bird in LA called a junco, a dark-eyed junco, little sparrow, and like bird. And juncos always were migratory, and suddenly they're becoming resident. This first happened in San Diego. It's now happening in LA. Canada geese, if you ever go, especially to the east, used to always be migratory. They've just decided to settle down because it's not that cold anymore. We are also certainly seeing extinctions, and plenty of those that are associated with climate change, at least local extinctions.
I would say great. Let's move on, but it's not great. So,
There's good and
but
there's
thanks,
bad.
thanks, Fred. Okay, so we're going to move on to AlexH and sea level rise. Get some ocean action in here.
All right. The percent of the population whose homes would be underwater with projected sea level rise is much lower in the LA metropolitan area than in greater Beijing, which includes Tianjin, which is it's a big metropolitan area there. The percent of the population whose homes would be underwater with projected sea level rise is about the same in Miami as it is in Shanghai. And the third one, the metropolitan region with the largest likely economic damage associated with projected sea level rise is in the United States.
Okay, so get out your phones and cue the music. Okay, it looks like there is some agreement amongst this crowd. Alex, can you tell us which one is the lie?
It's funny because this does not speak well for crowdsourcing information.
or maybe just we need to do a better job of talking about this stuff.
So it turns out that if you look at what sea level rise might eventually occur with a 2-degree warming, which is a pretty modest warming, about 3% of the homes in Southern California would be underwater. And in the greater Beijing, Tianjin area, that number is about 6 or 7%. So it's actually quite a bit higher in Beijing. So number one is true. But there are other metropolitan areas that are much more impacted. Miami in the U.S. is a big poster child for the impacts of sea level rise, and something like 40% of the homes would be underwater with that level of warming. And the number is actually similar for Shanghai, which is also built in a fairly low-lying area. A lot of reclaimed land and similar dynamics to what you find in places like Miami and New York. So number two is also true. And it turns out that the metropolitan region that would have the largest economic damage associated with sea level rise is actually not in the U.S. It turns out it's this urban agglomeration of Shenzhen and Guangzhou, which is near Hong Kong. This is an urban area that was built up over the past 20 years or so, I think, and has become a megacity almost really very quickly. And it was built on very low-lying areas in the Pearl River Delta, and it is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise, and because there is now quite a bit of expensive real estate near the coast in this area, it would be heavily hit economically by sea level rise. So number three is the
lie. Okay. So I think when people think about sea level rise, they might think of flooding, but not necessarily what the impacts or what is going to actually happen. So can you describe to us what kind of impacts we should expect in areas that are going to experience significant sea level rise?
So of course there's the flooding that occurs when sea level rises, and typically that we could expect that to occur in big storm events, where because the sea margin of course is not constant, it changes with time, and there are big storms that can bring storm surges, and if they coincide with high tide, that can bring a lot of water inland. But there are other big effects that are more insidious and in some ways more difficult. One is saltwater intrusion. So a lot of cities rely on groundwater for their water supply. Miami is an example of this. And Miami is currently experiencing real problems with its water supply because the water quality is deteriorated. It's become a lot more saline because the ocean water is intruding underneath the land. That's one example. There are cities with a lot of underground infrastructure. New York is a great example of that. But many cities have subways and sewer lines that are close to sea level or below sea level. That infrastructure is also really vulnerable. So those are some examples of other impacts of sea level rise.
Yeah, I've heard nightmare stories from Hurricane Sandy when people's septic systems backed up and they just had sewage in their basements because of so much water. That's becoming a more regular thing, not just with storms, but...
I was going to make a poop joke there, but like you said earlier, I'm not going to do
Anytime. Anytime.
it. I know how much you like that.
So what factors play a role in determining the impact of sea level rise? What's happening? There must be differences depending on where you are and maybe what the coastal habitats look like, or...
So there are big differences, and LA is an interesting example. As challenged as we are by climate change, particularly in water resources, sea level rise is not as damaging here as in other places, and that's mainly because we have pretty high topography in most of the urbanized landscape. That's not true in the Marina. Marina del Rey is very vulnerable, and the ports are also vulnerable infrastructure in Southern California, but it's nothing compared to cities like Miami, where much of the urbanized fabric is very near sea level, within a meter or two of sea level. And as I mentioned, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, New York is another example of a city where there's a lot of infrastructure very near sea level, and that's also a big factor. The other factor is there are the frequency of storms, and the types of storms that occur. So Miami is vulnerable because hurricanes occur in that part of the world. We don't have hurricanes in Los Angeles, so we don't have the types of storm surges that are associated with those big events.
So why do you think it's so hard for people to grasp sea level rise and take action? Because I know I live in North Carolina, coastal North Carolina, and we're getting surrounded by the sea, and people are just in complete denial about it. So why is it so hard?
I think it gets at the time frame question that you raised at the beginning of the evening. The sea level is rising slowly. If we're projecting conservatively a meter of sea level rise over the next century or so, every year that's a centimeter. So that's not noticeable enough, and so it's not something that people are motivated to confront. On the other hand, they are motivated to confront the impacts of extreme events, like if a hurricane brings in a storm surge, that can be made worse by sea level rise, and areas that don't normally get inundated would get inundated. But then we have this habit, when the extreme event is over, of rebuilding the way things were. And we don't take into account the fact that slowly things are changing. So I think our habits, our rebuilding habits, have to change. We have to start planning for the future when there are extreme events, so that we can cope better going forward.
Right, we need to start facing reality.
Facing reality. Interesting, in Florida, anyone in government's not allowed to mention climate change.
It's the same situation in North Carolina. They don't calculate it properly. They use old models.
They have started to allow people to use the word sea level rise. So you can't talk about what's causing it, but you can talk about the fact that it's happening, and I guess that's some kind of progress.
Take what you can get. Okay, thanks. We're gonna move on to Brad, and we're gonna talk about something that's on the minds of many right now.
Right. So we want to talk about fire, and fire is associated with climate change because it gets hotter, it gets drier, and certainly in some parts of the world, at least, that means there's more fires. So fire and biodiversity. First point. Small animals, including native mice, lizards, and toads, experience huge mortality during wildfires, whereas large animals, like deer and bobcats, experience minor mortality. Number 2, bird populations are often more negatively affected by wildfires than any other group of vertebrate animals. And vertebrates are fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. Number 3 is a study in the Santa Monica Mountains, just adjacent to LA, found that active revegetation with native seeds following wildfire was actually worse for native plant and animal recovery than simply letting natural revegetation occur. Okay, so
Get out your phones and cue the music.
Can't wait to see how this one goes. Sort of feels like the World Series, you know, winning.
Too soon.
Yeah. We good? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we should tell us, which is the
I
lie?
think we should do it. So, which is the lie? And it turns out this time you guys were right. The lie is A. The lie is the first one. Small animals, including native mice and lizards and my pals, lizards and toads and stuff, experience huge mortality during wildfires, whereas large animals like deer and bobcat experience minor. And the reason why it's a lie is kind of interesting, and I think speaks to a slightly broader point, which is that wildfires and their impacts on animals and plants, I mean especially animals, they're just very, very idiosyncratic. The devil is in the details with wildfires. It depends on the nesting season with birds. It's just game over, and it's kind of game over for everybody. And so it can be truly devastating for bird populations.